Hi guys, it's me. It is I, Mr. Bertoch, your phenomenally fantastic, horrifically handsome science teacher. And in this video, we are going to be learning about mitosis. We've talked about living things and the qualities of living things in other videos. And one of the things that we learned about in the video on cells is that all living things are made of cells. You'll remember in that video, and if you haven't watched it, go ahead and watch it if you'd like to. It's called Cells. All living things are made of cells, but we learned this theory called the cell theory, which is pretty much a fact, a cell fact. But it's not really possible to prove it unless you look at every cell in the entire world, and that's not really possible to do. But every cell we have ever looked at, and we've looked at, hundreds of thousands of them, when you take all of the scientists combined, every cell we've ever looked at follows the cell theory. So the cell theory states, again, that all living things are made of cells, but also that cells are the basic unit of life, and cells come from other cells. And that's the part of the cell theory that we're going to talk about in this video. Cells come from other cells. I cannot make a cell in a lab. It is impossible. It's never been done. Okay, I cannot take material as a scientist and go into a lab and arrange it into a living cell. It just isn't possible. Cells come only from other cells. Well, how does that work? How does a cell make another cell? The answer is mitosis. Mitosis is a fancy sciencey word that means cell division. Cells divide through mitosis. Okay. So, and almost all cells go through mitosis. Really, the only exception are like brain cells don't divide. They're not anymore anyway. They divide early on in the development as the brain is forming, but then the rest of your life they don't. You have a limited number of brain cells, so take care of them. But all of your other cells, your skin cells, your nostril cells, to take a random example, your heart cells, your whatever, all your cells, the cells in a potato, the cells of bacteria, the cells of leaves on trees, all of them are constantly dividing. They're splitting in half. And when that happens, you get two new cells, and we call them daughter cells. So there's a mother cell and there are daughter cells. The mother cell splits in half, and it forms two daughter cells. When a cell is not splitting, when it's just kind of doing its thing, it's growing and taking in nutrients and just being a cell, living its happy little cell life, we call that interphase. Okay, I'm going to go through some vocabulary in this video, quite a lot of vocabulary actually. So get ready to write down some things or to, permanently burn them into your brain. Okay, interphase. Interphase is a fancy sciencey word that means the cell is doing its normal thing. It's living its normal life. It is not splitting. When it is in interphase, it is not splitting. But then eventually it grows too big and it's like, gosh, golly darn it. I am tired of being this ginormous cell, so I'm going to split into two smaller daughter cells. When it starts to split, we call that prophase. The beginning of the splitting is prophase. In prophase, what we will see, and you can very distinctly see this happening through a microscope. If I look at a cell through a microscope, I can tell immediately that it's in prophase. What happens is inside of the nucleus, I start to get all these little clumps of chromosomes, the DNA, which is usually all spread out. It's all tangled and spread out inside the nucleus because it needs to be accessible, because the cell is using the DNA. The DNA is like the code. It's like the programming code that the cell is using to operate. And so it needs to be all spread out so that the cell has access to it. It can read it. But during prophase, all of that spread out, those noodles of DNA, that string, it all gets wound up into little tightly packed clumps called chromosomes. So as soon as we see those clumps in the nucleus, we know, okay, this cell is about to start to divide. It's in prophase. Prophase is the first phase of mitosis. Remember, mitosis is the fancy sciencey word that means to split. And the first phase of that is prophase, when we see clumps of DNA forming in the nucleus. Well, eventually, those clumps of DNA line up in the center of the nucleus. And we call that metaphase. So once we see the chromosomes, the clumps of DNA, lining up, they form this straight line across the middle of the nucleus, we know that the cell is in metaphase. What's happening, and I should probably back up and explain, that there are two copies. I should actually explain that too. I'm getting ahead of myself. So in prophase, the DNA is copied. Okay, we get two copies of the DNA. So I start with one copy of the DNA, and in prophase, the DNA is copied. It creates two copies, and then it clumps up, forming chromosomes. And in metaphase, those two copies are lined up across one set of the DNA on top and one set of the DNA on the bottom. So I have a complete set of DNA, all the DNA for that cell lined up across the top, and I have a complete set of DNA for that cell lined up across the bottom. Okay, and once that's done, and I have those lined up sets of DNA opposite each other, like a mirror image across the middle of the cell, then metaphase is done, and I start to go to anaphase. Anaphase is when the DNA starts to pull apart. So that mirror image starts to pull in opposite directions towards the ends of the nucleus, towards opposite sides of the nucleus, one towards the top of the nucleus and one set of DNA towards the bottom. So as I see those pull apart, I know I'm in anaphase. And then I move into telophase. And telophase is when the nucleus, but now it's nuclei because there are going to be two of them, split. So the nucleus splits in half and it forms two nuclei. So now I have a cell with two nuclei, and they're identical to each other because the DNA first was replicated, and then it was all squished up into chromosomes in prophase, and then in metaphase, it did what? Do you remember? It lined up down the center across, creating a mirror image in the center of the nuclei. And then in anaphase, it's pulled apart. And then in telophase, the nuclei pinched itself in half, or the nucleus pinched itself in half, and it formed nuclei. Nuclei is plural for nucleus. So it formed nuclei. It formed two nucleuses. Okay. Well, now I still am not quite done. I'm almost done, but not quite, because I still need to pinch off the cells and make two totally separate cells. And that process is called cytokinesis. Cytokinesis is the fancy sciencey word that means the cell, what was one cell, pinches off and becomes two cells with one nucleus going to either of the cells, and it takes some of the organelles with it on either side. And I have two much smaller daughter cells, which are identical to the original mother cell. And now these two daughter cells are like, hooray! And then they will spend some time. Do you remember what it's called when they are not dividing. Okay, it's called interphase. They're going to spend some time, these daughter cells, living their happy little lives in interphase, but eventually they are also going to be like, you know what? Let's split. And they're going to divide in half, and then you'll have 4 cells. And then eventually those 4 cells are going to divide in half, and you'll have 8 cells. And it goes on for evers and evers and evers. Your body right now, that is you, has cells in it that came from the cells of your parents, and they came from the cells of your grandparents, and they came from the cells of your great-grandparents, and so on and so forth. Cells come from other cells. We cannot make cells in a lab. So the cells that are you are literally came from your ancestors. Cell division over and over and over and over and over and over and over forever. And your cells, though you will die, some of them will go on in, if you have children, in your children and your grandchildren. They'll just keep going, although that's a little bit different than mitosis, but it's your cells dividing. And that is how the part of the cell theory, cells come from other cells, occurs through the process of mitosis. Hi guys, thanks for watching my video. These rambling science videos where I go unscripted and just kind of barf up all the science knowledge out of my head are part of a series that go along with an online class that I teach, which you can sign up for if you go to handsomescienceteacher.com. I also have a whole bunch of free resources for homeschoolers. I have hundreds of articles on every topic that covers your entire science curriculum from 5th through 8th grade. I have online games and quizzes, all curated and written by this handsome guy, a science teacher with, well, three degrees, but 2 of them are in science. So it's targeted right to and directly to your science students. So sign up, subscribe to the channel, and I release lots of videos. Also, in addition to these ones, lots of little short videos that are like 2 minutes long that cover science topics. Those ones you don't get to see my handsome face, but they're still good videos, and they're much more targeted, and those ones are scripted, so you don't have to hear me like you are right now going blah blah blah. The end. Subscribe. Thank you. Goodbye.